You're watching The Breaking Point. Today's episode is titled May 31st, 1945, the Interim Committee Meeting. In this episode, we examine how a single meeting transformed the use of nuclear weapons from a matter of debate into a matter of procedure, based entirely on official records and documented decisions. Let's begin.
Okay, so our mission today is to take this whole stack of primary source material. We have official memos, top secret diary entries, committee minutes, and really figure out how this monumental decision was ultimately made.
We're diving deep into the administrative and, the ethical crucible of 1945. What the documents show us is a project moving at this almost overwhelming speed. It's being driven by scientific breakthroughs, sure, but also by just immense resources.
So the question wasn't really if the bomb would be ready.
Not at all. The question was always how it would be used. And that's where the conflict really begins. Exactly. And we're going to zero in on a single pivotal moment. The Interim Committee meeting on May 31st, 1945. Now, this wasn't necessarily where the bomb was authorized in the final sense. That had, happened in stages much earlier.
Right. But this meeting is the place where the debate over ethical targeting, over civilian versus military targets, effectively ends. It's the moment the use of this new weapon transforms from a highly conflicted question into a standardized, almost procedural military operation.
We're going to trace that line of conflict. We'll start with the very first scientific realization back in 1940 that a bomb like this was even possible.
And we'll follow it right through to the final, decisive presidential order in August 1945 to halt any further strikes.
We're looking for that precise moment in the paper trail where moral restraint was administratively overridden by operational momentum.
Okay, let's unpack this journey. Let's start at the very beginning with those first scientific sparks, years before the weapon even existed. ###1. Early context, scientific foresight, and the path to military control. 1940, December 1943. The initial thinking about targets, and really the moral limits of this new technology, it actually began with the scientists themselves. This was well before any concrete plan for military use was even on the table.
Right, and as the analysis from Sean Malloy's work on nuclear targeting shows, just the bare possibility of the bomb immediately raised this profound ethical dilemma.
It starts surprisingly early. We're talking March of 1940 in Great Britain. There were two emigre physicists, Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, working independently.
And their theoretical conclusions are what really kickstarted the Allied program.
Yes, but what's so fascinating when you look at the documents is the sheer predictive power of their analysis. Frisch and Peierls concluded that the amount of uranium-235 needed to achieve a critical mass.
Yeah.
Well, that's the point where an uncontrolled chain reaction could happen.
The explosion itself.
Exactly, and they calculated that this amount might be as little as 1 kilogram.
Just 1 kilogram. It's
Yeah.
it's almost hard to wrap your head around that small amount of material creating such an effect.
It is, and the sources are clear on this. Malloy's analysis of their memorandum points out that this realization, that specific small number, is what immediately led them to conclude the weapon would have what they called special qualities.
Special qualities that raise ethical questions about its use in combat right from the conceptual stage.
Precisely. The physicists knew right then and there that they were inventing something that just defied what the documents call the rules of civilized warfare.
But even with those early ethical flags being raised by the scientists, the operational focus began to narrow very, very quickly.
It did. American planners started moving toward target selection. And the documents are very specific. From May 1943 onwards, more than 2 years before the bomb was actually dropped, the focus administratively just cemented on Japan as the primary target.
So why Japan and not Germany? I mean, at that point in the war, the Allies were still deeply concerned about the German atomic program, weren't they?
They were. And the Malloy analysis indicates this early targeting decision was based partly on tactical considerations. Specifically, it was about which enemy power might be able to exploit the knowledge gained from witnessing the bomb's use.
So it was an intelligence assessment?
It was a key intelligence filter. The Germans were believed to be actively pursuing their own atomic program. Using the bomb against them, risked providing them with valuable, exploitable data to advance their own research.
But the Japanese were seen as different.
Yes. The same documented intelligence assessment, as cited by Malloy, concluded that the Japanese, quote, would not be so apt to secure knowledge from it as would the Germans.
So the choice of the entire theater of war was rooted in an intelligence assessment of exploitation risk. It was about knowledge containment, not just pure military necessity.
At the same time, the project itself was being formalized into this massive administrative engine.
And we can see that in the official records. The institutional framework for this whole effort was formally charted in March 1942.
We have Document 2A from the Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II collection. It's a piece of correspondence between Vannevar Bush and President Roosevelt, and it really shows this foundational decision to shift control.
So, what did Bush say to the president?
Bush reported to Roosevelt that the project was still on a, quote, pilot plant basis. It wasn't ready for mass production yet, and he formally proposed that once the, quote, production plants were up and running by the summer, the War Department, the military, should take over complete operational and administrative control of the project.
And Roosevelt's response.
It's attached to the memo. He replied just 2 days later, on March 11, 1942. He endorsed Bush's ideas immediately. His one major condition was that absolute secrecy must be maintained.
And the description for this document in the collection we're using, and notes that this transfer of authority was later characterized by Robert S. Norris as the fateful decision.
The fateful decision to turn the atomic project over to military command. That phrase really captures the gravity of this moment. This wasn't a debate about use yet. It was a debate about who held the keys to the project.
And handing it to the military, well, that solidified the path toward weaponization, rather than, say, a purely scientific or diplomatic holding pattern.
Once it was under military authority, through what was called the Military Policy Committee, the planning just exploded in scale. We see this in Document 2E, a secret report to President Roosevelt, dated December 15, 1942.
And what does that report cover?
It reviews a huge number of procedural and logistical issues. The scale of the planning is just staggering. It covered parameters for various methods of producing fissile material, funding issues, estimations for the size of a deliverable bomb, time schedules.
So the whole production line.
The whole thing. Heavy water procurement, assessments of German progress. It even documented the status of cooperation and information sharing with the Canadians and the British. This project was, from that point, a global administrative behemoth.
And by late 1943, the engineering work was getting very specific.
Highly detailed. It even included integrating the weapon into existing delivery systems. Malloy's excerpts mention serious discussions about converting the gun-type uranium bomb assembly to, and I'm quoting here, fit in the space occupied by a Mark 13 torpedo.
A torpedo. So they were testing for naval use as well.
They were. The document notes they even conducted physical tests in an experimental pond at the Anchor Ranch Proving Ground near Los Alamos. They were trying to make it a kind of plug-and-play weapon for different military applications.
But this proliferation of different designs started to worry the project leadership.
That's right. By December of 1943, Los Alamos director J. Robert Oppenheimer expressed concerns to the project leadership. He felt the Ordnance Division was pursuing too many separate, costly, and perhaps non-essential designs.
And Oppenheimer initiated a clear procedural streamlining.
Yes, the Malloy source notes, he specifically recommended that work on what was called the UW program, which included that atomic depth charge or torpedo be, quote, temporarily postponed.
So he was narrowing the focus.
He was. This decision really highlights how the project leadership was actively filtering the work, focusing on the most viable design for primary military use, which was the airborne gravity bomb. This streamlining reinforced that singular operational trajectory.
The administrative scale of the Manhattan Engineer District, which directed the whole project, just confirms the momentum it had gained by this point.
The Harrison-Bundy files cite that this complex administrative effort included research, design, development, testing, and production programs across numerous laboratories and field installations.
We're talking about huge facility.
Massive. The Clinton engineer works at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, which was performing separation of uranium isotopes. The Hanford engineer works in Washington, which produced plutonium, and of course, the laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, which did the final processing and assembled the bombs.
And the cost and manpower behind this.
By the end of 1945, the overall cost of the Manhattan Project had reached nearly $2 billion. It employed over 129,000 people, working in these contained facilities in over 30 cities.
That kind of financial and human investment, it just creates this massive administrative inertia. The idea that a project of this size under military control for years could just be halted for a moral debate becomes, increasingly unlikely.
And that administrative structure survived the war too. The Manhattan Engineer District was eventually inherited by the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, which was established by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. But by the end of 1943, that military machine was fully funded, administratively streamlined, and focused on a single theater of operations. Hashtag #2. Targeting consensus versus moral concerns. September 1944, May 29th, 1945.
So, as the technical project just hurtles forward, that philosophical conflict we talked about moves from scientific theory into high level strategic planning. This period, from late 1944 into the spring of 45, is really defined by this growing rift between operational military requirements and the moral concerns of civilian leaders.
Yes, and that early moral debate centered on a really fundamental question. Did the bomb need to be used in combat at all? The Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II compilation summarizes a September 1944 memorandum. In it, Navy Captain William S. Parsons formally presents his objections to a non-combat demonstration.
That's interesting because it confirms that the idea of a demonstration was a serious high level consideration.
Very serious. Parsons noted that people in, quote, high and responsible quarters had proposed a staged field test in an American desert.
And their argument was purely diplomatic.
Entirely. The idea was that it would demonstrate, quote, our victory over the atom and our potential power to win victories over our future enemies, all without killing civilians.
But Parsons opposed this.
He did. And Parsons, who would later become the weaponeer on the Enola Gay, his opposition helped to solidify the military consensus that the weapon's impact had to be demonstrated in a real-world combat scenario to achieve the maximum psychological effect on Japan.
And at the same time, you have Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, who had administrative oversight of the whole project, documenting his own very serious concerns and strategic calculations.
His diary entries from May 14th and 15th, 1945, are really revealing. They confirm these detailed conversations he was having about S-1, which was the code name for the atomic bomb.
Stimson saw the bomb as more than just a weapon, didn't he?
He saw it as the ultimate piece of diplomatic leverage. During a conversation with Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy, Stimson estimated that possession of the bomb gave Washington a tremendous advantage in dealing with Moscow on all the post-war problems.
The quote from his diary is just astonishing. He said he held all the cards, calling the bomb a royal straight flush.
That phrase, a royal straight flush, recorded right there in the Stimson diary for May 14th and 15th, 1945, it just crystallizes the belief that the bomb was less about winning the war in the Pacific, which they believed was nearly won anyway, and more about establishing post-war global dominance over the Soviets.
And he was still focused on this the next day.
He was. His discussion of divergences with Moscow over the Far East made him wonder if the bomb would be ready when Truman met with Stalin in July. He believed that if it was, the bomb would be the, quote, master card in U.S. diplomacy.
But this diplomatic calculation was, it was balanced by a very real moral struggle.
It was. We see that in John J. McCloy's diary entry from May 21st, 1945. It records a serious discussion he had with Stimson about the question of the big bomb and, quote, when it should be employed and how.
And McCloy notes Stimson's state of mind.
Yes, McCloy confided to his diary that Stimson discussed this with explicit reference to the moral position of the United States and its responsibilities. McCloy wrote that the moral position of the U.S. weighs greatly upon Stimson with respect to the bomb's use. It shows the Secretary of War was genuinely wrestling with the ethics of it.
And this wrestling match resulted in some early attempts to steer the targeting away from, just bombing cities full of people.
Exactly. The Malloy analysis cites a draft public statement. It was prepared by one of Stimson's aides, Arthur Page, on May 25, 1945. And it declared that the United States would select a military target like a naval base, if possible, so that wholesale killing of civilians would be minimized.
So there's clear evidence of the civilian leadership trying to establish a moral boundary.
A very clear boundary. But here's the disconnect. While Stimson was in his office drafting statements about naval bases, the operational apparatus below him had already moved on. Malloy's analysis confirms that the momentum for city targeting was growing and accelerating at the lower military levels.
So by December 1944, months before these high-level ethical debates really peaked, the U.S. Army Air Force and the Target Committee were already focused on specific cities.
Yes, cities that were identified as harboring important Japanese war industries. And this operational preference for cities was formally ratified at the Third Target Committee meeting, held in Washington on May 28, 1945.
What did the minutes of that meeting say?
The minutes of this top-secret meeting confirmed that the target would definitively be a city. They were already listing Hiroshima and Kyoto among the primary considerations.
And critically, the Target Committee reached a consensus on how to use it.
A very specific consensus. The recommendation, as recorded in the sources analyzed in 4 days in May, was to use the first gadget in center of selected city.
In the center. They weren't aiming for the industrial targets on the fringe, they were aiming for the bullseye.
And this choice was made despite the clear technical knowledge that the most significant military-industrial targets were actually located on the urban fringes.
So why the center? It seems counterintuitive if the goal is to destroy war industry.
The Malloy analysis explains this paradox. Targeting the fringes risked inaccuracy. A miss could mean the bomb explodes entirely outside the city, wasting its effect. But the decision to aim for the center was very deliberate.
And what was the reason?
It was about the bomb's design. As developed by Los Alamos, the bomb was optimized for blast destruction against light structures, the kinds of wooden buildings found in abundance in Japanese cities. Targeting the heavy factories on the urban fringes would fail to make use of the bomb's full power. The technical design of the weapon itself essentially dictated that the target had to be a densely populated area to maximize the destructive effect.
And while this was happening, diplomatic alternatives were still being floated.
They were. On May 28, 1945, Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew held a conversation with President Truman. Grew, who was a former ambassador to Japan, advocated that the failure to clarify U.S. intentions regarding the preservation of the Emperor institution will ensure prolongation of the war and cost a large number of human lives. He believed diplomacy could end the war faster than any weapon.
So the tension between the military's consensus for city targeting and these high-level moral reservations finally came to a head on May 29, 1945.
It did. On that date, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, who was apparently unaware of the operational consensus for city targeting, emphasized to Stimson the use of straight military objectives. He specifically mentioned a large naval installation.
So Marshall's position directly mirrored Stimson's own moral concerns.
It did. It mirrored Stimson's concerns and a 1943 recommendation from the Military Policy Committee about the mass killing of civilians. But here's the dramatic disconnect that Malloy's analysis points out. Neither Marshall nor Stimson was aware that the Target Committee had already formally ratified the plan to target city centers the day before.
The high-level moral debate was completely disconnected from the operational reality already being set in motion.
And as the top men were debating morality, the administrative gears just kept turning. That same day, May 29, a top-secret memo regarding the 509th Composite Group, Special Functions, was sent to General Loris Norstad. This was part of a plan of operations that was forwarded by General Groves to the Army Chief of Operations for the atomic bombings. The procedure was moving forward, regardless of the ethical discussions happening in Stimson's office.
The clash was unavoidable at this point.
It was. The very next day, May 30th, 1945, these divergent approaches to nuclear targeting collided in Stimson's Pentagon office. Harvey Bundy, Stimson's personal assistant, placed a call to General Groves at 9:20 a.m. to inform him that the secretary wanted to see him immediately. #3. The Interim Committee meeting and the targeting compromise. May 31st, 1945.
So that urgent phone call on May 30th leads directly to this pivotal moment, the formal gathering of the Interim Committee on May 31st, 1945. Now, this committee was authorized by President Truman earlier in May, and its official purpose was to discuss the long-term future of atomic energy.
Right. But its deliberations on that day, as Malloy's analysis notes, they spilled over into the immediate urgent question of how the bomb should be used in combat.
This is the critical administrative moment. It's where the operational momentum and that high-level moral debate collide head-on and are, for all practical purposes, resolved.
The meeting assembled at 10:00 a.m. in the Secretary of War's Pentagon office. The attendees included Stimson, Marshall, Groves, the regular members of the Interim Committee, and, crucially, the newly created Scientific Advisory Panel.
And the scientific panel. This included the heavyweights.
It did. The documents show it included the prominent physicists, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Arthur H. Compton, and Ernest O. Lawrence. Their presence was essential to lend scientific weight and authority to the military decision-making process.
Stimson, who was hosting the meeting, allowed General Marshall to restate the moral position one more time.
Yes, Marshall again suggested first using the weapons against what he called straight military objectives, like a large naval installation. He was trying to hold the line against targeting civilians.
And he even proposed a kind of phased approach, didn't he?
He did. According to excerpts from 4 Days in May, Marshall argued that if that first military strike didn't yield a complete result, then a number of large manufacturing areas should be designated. And then, crucially, the Japanese would be warned to leave, telling the Japanese that we intend to destroy such centers.
He was focused on the historical record.
Completely. He emphasized that, quote, every effort should be made to keep our record of warning clear. And he said this was to offset the opprobrium which might follow from an ill-considered employment of such force. He was predicting the future judgment of history.
But his proposal was essentially dead on arrival. And this is where the technical reality of the weapon just dictates the administrative outcome.
It does. As documented in 4 Days in May, the bomb as designed was optimized for the destruction of cities and civilians. It was built to destroy light structures, which meant the city center was its most effective target.
So Stimson had a choice to make.
An almost impossible choice. Given the nearly $2 billion invested, the ongoing Pacific War, and the consensus recommendation from Groves, Oppenheimer, and the Target Committee for use against a city, Stimson likely viewed the outcome as, well, an acceptable compromise.
And what was that compromise, according to the Malloy analysis?
It involved selecting a mixed civilian and military-industrial target. This would leverage the bomb's blast optimization. But in return, Stimson secured a symbolic victory for moral restraint.
And that victory was the removal of Kyoto from the target list.
Exactly. Kyoto was a large city, but it was also historically and culturally priceless. Stimson's intervention, which was rooted in his long-held moral concerns about the mass killing of civilians, successfully led to the administrative removal of Kyoto from the list, despite military resistance.
And the documents show just how concrete the planning for Kyoto had been.
Oh yes, a June 1945 target map, found in General Groves' files, shows an atomic bomb aiming point specifically indicated for Kyoto. Stimson's objection was a significant administrative override. It illustrates how he successfully prevented Groves from putting it back on the final target list.
So the compromise was procedural. The committee agrees to use the weapon against an urban target like Hiroshima, which maintains the operational momentum and technical efficiency.
But they grant Stimson the symbolic win of protecting the most culturally important target, Kyoto. It was a trade-off.
And what about the other major alternative, the non-combat demonstration?
That was also resolved during this period. The sources, including the one titled Henry Stimson Didn't Go to Kyoto, note that Oppenheimer reported on the scientific panel's conclusions against a demonstration at this very same May 31st meeting.
And what was their reasoning?
The panel argued that a demonstration might fail. It might be a dud. Or the Japanese might be able to intercept the bomber or even move prisoners of war into the demonstration area. This opposition, coming from the top scientists, administratively dismissed the key alternative that dissenters had been pushing for.
So the Interim Committee meeting on May 31st, 1945, really acted as this procedural compromise. It didn't just discuss the bomb, it ratified a policy.
It did. A policy that combined the destructive capability optimized for city targets with a high-level nod toward limiting the most symbolically important cultural targets. And it dismissed the option of a non-combat demonstration. It essentially set the final, irreversible procedure for combat use, #4. The debate over alternatives and the search for international control, June 1945. But even after that administrative consensus was reached on May 31st, the debate over alternatives didn't just stop. It continued actively among scientists and some high-ranking officials right through June 1945. They were focused on warning Japan and establishing international control.
These dissenters hadn't given up. They were still trying to force a reconsideration.
The most famous act of dissent came from the scientists at the Metallurgical Laboratory, or MET Lab, which was the cover for the project's fuel production program at the University of Chicago.
Right, this is the Franck report.
Exactly.
Okay.
On June 12, 1945, the concerns of these scientists coalesced in a formal document. It was a memorandum from Arthur B. Compton to the Secretary of War, and it enclosed the memorandum on political and social problems from members of the Metallurgical Laboratory of the University of Chicago. It was classified secret.
And this report was produced by a committee chaired by Compton, with major contributions from physicists Leo Szilard and the Nobel Prize winner James Franck. These were the very scientists whose work made the weapon possible.
They were.
Yeah.
And Document 16 in the Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II collection summarizes their report. The committee explicitly rejected a surprise attack on Japan. Instead, they formally recommended a demonstration of the bomb on the, quote, desert or a barren island.
So they were arguing for the very alternative the Interim Committee had just dismissed?
They were. And their core argument against surprise use was profoundly forward-looking. The Franck Committee report warned that a nuclear arms race will be on in earnest not later than the morning after our first demonstration of the existence of nuclear weapons.
That's an incredible prophecy. They saw the geopolitical implications immediately.
They did. They saw international control as the only necessary alternative, and they believed that this possibility would be difficult, if not impossible, if the United States made first military use of the weapon. Compton, the Met Lab's director, urged Stimson to study the report, even while he personally raised doubts about the recommendations.
But just 4 days later, the official scientific advisory body issued a contradictory opinion.
It did. Document 19, which is the top-secret recommendations on the immediate use of nuclear weapons, dated June 16, 1945, was authored by J.R. Oppenheimer and his colleagues, Compton, Ernest O. Lawrence, and Enrico Fermi.
And this panel, the same one from the May 31st meeting, they tacitly disagreed with the Met Lab scientists.
They did. While they argued for early military use, they also advised informing key allies about the project to open a dialogue on how we can cooperate in making this development contribute to improved international relations. But their priority was immediate military use.
So the official panel backed up the administrative decision that had already been made.
Yes. And meanwhile, another critical diplomatic alternative was being advocated by Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew. In a memorandum to President Truman on June 13, 1945, titled Analysis of Memorandum Presented by Mr. Hoover, Grew argued his point again.
This is about the emperor.
Right. Grew argued that failing to clarify U.S. intentions on the status of the emperor will ensure prolongation of the war and cost a large number of human lives. His belief, stemming from his time as ambassador to Japan, was that this diplomatic move could end the war.
And he wasn't alone in pushing for alternatives. There was also Under Secretary of the Navy Ralph Bard.
Yes. Document 23 contains his June 27, 1945, Memorandum on the Use of S-1 Bomb. In it, Bard explicitly sought to avoid military use of the bomb. He proposed a preliminary warning so that the United States would retain its position as a great humanitarian nation.
But while all these scientific and diplomatic pleas were being made, the political leaders were coordinating military strategy with the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
On June 18, 1945, a top-secret meeting was held at the White House. The minutes detail the military appraisal of the situation.
And what was that appraisal?
The discussion, documented in the minutes of meeting held at the White House on Monday, 18 June 1945 at 15:30, depicted a Japan that by November 1st would be close to defeat from bombing and blockade, but not yet ready to capitulate.
And General Marshall believed Japan's capitulation required two things:
Soviet entry into the war and an invasion of Kyushu. He even suggested that Soviet entry might be the decisive action levering them into capitulation.
The minutes show that Truman and the chiefs reviewed plans to land troops on Kyushu on November 1st, which Marshall believed was essential because he felt air power alone was not decisive.
Right, but this A count, it hints at a discussion of the atomic bomb by mentioning certain other matters, but no documents disclose the specific content of that part of the meeting. This highlights a limitation in the available records. The bomb was still being treated as a separate, compartmentalized subject, #TAG5, Final Directives, Test Success, and Delegated Authority, July 1945.
So, with those diplomatic and scientific debates largely settled by the end of June, the administrative focus shifts entirely to operational readiness. This culminates in the issuance of the final use directive right before the Potsdam Conference.
There was a lot of pressure from the chain of command to formalize responsibility. The Arnold Diary, in entries from July 22nd and 23rd, 1945, shows Army Air Forces General Henry Hap Arnold was being updated on the plans.
It seems the top Army Air Force commanders didn't want to take responsibility for this themselves.
It appears that way. Marshall, who was in Potsdam, was following up on securing formal authorization for using the weapons on urban targets. He requested General Handy to prepare a draft of the use directive, but it was General Groves who actually wrote the draft. That was then sent to Potsdam for Marshall's approval.
And just before that directive was signed, the technical viability of the weapon was confirmed once and for all.
That's the crucial step. General Groves provided Secretary Stimson, who was also at Potsdam, with a detailed account of the successful Trinity test. This top-secret memo, titled The Test, and dated July 18, 1945, confirmed the technical viability of the weapon. It worked.
With that scientific certainty in hand, the administrative chain of command executed the final order.
On July 25, 1945, Marshall informed Handy that Secretary of War Stimson had approved the text of the directive.
So on that same day, Handy signed off on a directive which ordered the use of atomic weapons on Japan.
Yes. It specified that the first weapon was assigned to one of four possible targets: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, or Nagasaki.
Ah.
But there was another part of that directive that's incredibly important.
What was that?
It mandated that, quote, additional bombs will be delivered on the targets as soon as made ready by the project staff.
So this wasn't an order for a single strike.
Not at all. It was a standing authorization for a scheduled campaign. It was a delegation of authority. Once the first bomb was authorized, the subsequent bombs were automatically delegated to the operational staff to use as soon as they came off the assembly line. The decision to use was converted into a technical procedure of delivery.
And there were documents laying out the specifics of this procedure.
Yes, Document 46E, a memorandum from Groves for the Army Chief of Staff titled Plan of Operations Atomic Fission Bomb, dated July 24th, 1945, laid out the operational blueprint.
And Document 46C, the Memorandum of Conference with General Groves from July 19th, it gets into the technical parameters.
It does. It includes a discussion point suggesting that the destruction of industrial areas would require a lower blast elevation at 1,400 feet. This is a very specific parameter of weapon effects that was being set.
And all of this was happening against a backdrop of last-ditch diplomatic efforts by Japan.
Yes. The Magic Diplomatic Summary from August 3, 1945, a top-secret ultra document, showed intercepts of Japanese diplomatic reporting. It covered the Soviet buildup in the Far East and Foreign Minister Togo's cable to his ambassador, instructing him to arrange an interview with Molotov. They were still trying for a diplomatic way out.
But the operational deployment was already in motion. On August 5, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay took off from Tinian.
And on board was William Parsons, the weaponeer in charge of arming the bomb in flight.
The same Captain Parsons who had argued against a non-combat demonstration a year earlier.
Very same. The man who, as the Malloy excerpts point out, played a crucial role in designing a weapon for use against cities at Los Alamos, would now oversee its use against Japan.
And the specific aiming point for the Hiroshima mission that was also determined by practical procedural considerations.
It was. Bombardier Thomas Fariby and navigator Theodore Van Kirk selected the Ioi Bridge over the Oko River as the aim point. Why? Because of its easily recognizable T-shape and its location right in the center of the city, it ensured the procedure decided on May 31st was carried out precisely. Hashtag 6. The operational debut and high-level reactions, August 6 to 8, 1945.
So the first military use of the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, it triggers these immediate documented reactions from the highest levels of the U.S. and Japanese governments. It confirmed the weapon's power and kicked off these crucial internal discussions about what it all meant.
Yes, we have Document 64, the Walter Brown Diary entry, for August 6, 1945. It records President Truman's reaction. He was aboard the USS Augusta returning from the Potsdam Conference after learning about the bombing of Hiroshima.
And what was his reaction, according to the diary?
He announced the success twice. First to the commissioned officers in the wardroom, and then to the sailors' mess. He emphasized the explosive yield. The diary notes he was still unaware of the radiation effects at this point.
Truman then met with Secretary of State Burns.
He did, and they discussed the Manhattan Project's secrecy and its huge expenditures. Truman noted that, as chair of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, only on the appeal of Secretary of War Stimson did he refrain and let the War Department continue with the experiment unmolested.
And when the news of the bombing reached Tokyo, it forced an immediate internal administrative debate.
A huge debate. This is documented in Document 67A, the Cabinet meeting and Togo's meeting with the Emperor, from August 7-12, 1945, from a Foreign Ministry compilation.
What happened in that meeting?
Foreign Minister Togo learned of the atomic bombing from the Domai News Agency, and he immediately believed it was time to give up. He advised the cabinet that the atomic attack provided the occasion for Japan to surrender on the basis of the Potsdam Declaration.
But the cabinet wasn't persuaded.
Not at first. Togo couldn't persuade them. The army wanted to delay any decisions until it had learned what had actually happened to Hiroshima. They wanted data.
But when Togo met with Emperor Hirohito, the emperor had a different view.
He did. The emperor agreed with the foreign minister. He declared that the top priority was an early end to the war. He said it would be acceptable to seek better surrender terms, probably U.S. acceptance of a figurehead emperor, but only if seeking those terms did not interfere with the primary goal of ending the war.
Following these imperial instructions, Togo and Prime Minister Suzuki agreed that the Supreme War Council should meet the next day.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, the strategic implications were being considered immediately. Document 71, a memorandum of conference with the president on August 8, 1945, recorded in the Stimson diary, details Stimson's briefing of Truman on the scale of the destruction.
And Truman recognized the terrible responsibility that was on his shoulders.
He did. And consistent with his earlier attempts, Stimson encouraged Truman to find ways to expedite Japan's surrender by using kindness and tact, and not treating them the same way as the Germans.
Stimson and Truman also discussed pending post-war legislation on the atom.
Yes, and the Henry D. Smith report on the scientific work underlying the Manhattan Project and post-war domestic controls of the atom.
At the same time, the Soviet Union was engaged in critical discussions about this new weapon.
Document 69, a top-secret memorandum of conversation, Far Eastern War and General Situation, from August 8, 1945, records a meeting between Ambassador Harriman and Stalin. This was shortly after the Soviet declaration of war on Japan.
And during this meeting, Stalin reviewed Soviet military gains in the Far East.
He did. And the two also discussed the possible impact of the atomic bombing, which occurred before Nagasaki, and the dangers and difficulty of an atomic weapons program.
And notably, Stalin used this conversation to disclose that the Soviets were working on their own atomic program.
He did. The Frank Report's prophecy from June was coming true. The arms race was on, #7, the second attack and the presidential halt order, August 10th, 1945.
So despite all these internal diplomatic maneuvers in Tokyo and the strategic discussions happening in Washington, that operational directive to continue atomic strikes, it remained in effect.
It did, and that led directly to the second attack on August 9th, 1945.
We have cables from the Tinian files that detail the operational shift for this second mission. The prime target was supposed to be Kokura.
Yes, Kokura had a large army arsenal and ordnance works. But various problems, likely weather or poor visibility, ruled that city out.
So instead, the crew of the B-29 carrying the Fat Man plutonium bomb flew to an alternate target at Nagasaki. We see this in the records in Document 73.
And this shows the delegated authority in action. The crew made the final call in the air, based on conditions, not a new presidential order.
The bombing of Nagasaki killed immediately at least 39,000 people, with more dying later. It underscored the destructive outcome of that delegated authority established by the July 25 directive.
Following this, diplomatic and military communication just intensified rapidly. Document 64A, the top-secret ultra-magic diplomatic summary from August 10, 1945, contained the first Japanese offer of surrender.
And on that same day, August 10th, General Groves sent another top-secret memo to Chief of Staff George C. Marshall.
He did. It was regarding plans for the use of a third atomic weapon sometime after August 17, depending on the weather. The operational machine was still moving forward.
And this memo documenting plans for more strikes, it prompted an immediate administrative action from Marshall. He was following new instructions from President Truman to halt the operational flow.
Yes, and Marshall's handwritten note on Gross's memo is the critical administrative action here. It explicitly stated the new constraint.
What did it say?
It said, "It is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the president."
So that single note effectively rescinded the previous broad delegation of authority from the July 25 directive.
Completely. It was the final, critical administrative outcome. It showed President Truman's decision to re-centralize control over nuclear strikes, ending the period of delegated, scheduled use. Any future use was now converted back into a singular presidential decision. Hashtag 8. Post-halt administrative planning and tactical concepts. August 13th, December 1945.
But even after President Truman issued that halt order on August 10th, the internal administrative discussions and war planning, they continued. They were already exploring potential future applications of the weapons, including concepts of tactical nuclear use.
That's right. Document 87, a top-secret telephone conversation transcript from August 13th, 1945. Just 3 days after the halt order evidences this ongoing planning.
This was between General John E. Hull from the War Department's Operations Division and Colonel Ellie Seaman, one of Grove's associates.
And they were continuing to think about further nuclear use and its relationship to a possible invasion of Japan, motivated by uncertainty about Japan's next step.
And Hull asked if they should not concentrate on targets that will be of greatest assistance to an invasion rather than industry, morale, psychology, etc.
It's a major shift in thinking, and Seaman agreed with this shift toward targets of nearer the tactical use. They even discussed specific tactics that could be employed for beach landings. This shows that concepts of tactical nuclear weapons use first came to light right at the close of World War II.
And the administrative transition toward regulating the technology in peacetime also began.
It did. The Interim Committee was always intended to discuss the future of atomic energy, and Stimson and Truman had discussed post-war legislation and the Smith Report on August 8.
Following the war, these discussions concerning the control of atomic energy led to the formation of the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946.
And the debate over domestic control involved a proposal from Vannevar Bush that the president agreed to, but also a conflicting proposal from Frank Jewett of the National Academy of Sciences.
Jewett initially offered to set up an academy advisory board to the military departments, but he was later forced to withdraw his offer.
He was, because the War Department refused to provide the necessary secret atomic data. The military was trying to maintain its control.
Ultimately, the bill submitted to Congress by Senator McMahon in December 1945 included provisions for exclusion of the military from any policy-making functions and appointment of a full-time 5-member commission by the president. A compromise version passed the Senate on June 1st, 1946.
And President Truman publicly addressed the development at the annual Gridiron Dinner on December 15, 1945. Document 96, his handwritten remarks for the dinner, records his comment on the atomic bombings at the event.
Finally, there's a 1947 article entitled "The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb." It was published under Henry Stimson's name, but it was produced by McGeorge Bundy out of drafts by prominent A-bomb insiders.
And this article suggested that the bomb had always been considered as legitimate as any of the other of the deadly explosive weapons of modern war. It implied that its use against Japanese cities had raised no special moral concerns.
So it effectively preempted a serious discussion of the choice of cities and civilians as targets.
Exactly. It was a final administrative act to shape the historical narrative, cementing the procedural decisions of May 1945 into the official story.
If you found this episode useful, make sure to subscribe. All sources used in this episode are linked in the description of the video.